The year 1941. The war had been raging across Europe for 2 years, and Winston Churchill, Britain's indomitable Prime Minister, was already a symbol of resistance. His voice rallied a nation that had seen the worst of humanity. Yet, behind his speeches of resolve, there was a mission shrouded in secrecy, one that could alter the course of the war, and the fate of the world. It was not just about defeating Hitler, it was about the very survival of Britain itself. This is the story of Churchill's secret rescue mission, the Operation Britain Could Not Fail. Amid the threat of invasion and the constant bombardment of the Blitz, Churchill knew that Britain could not rely solely on military might. The country had suffered heavy losses, and the future looked uncertain. But Churchill's foresight saw beyond the immediate challenges. A secret operation was underway that could tip the scales of the war. A mission that, if successful, would secure Britain's position in the fight against Nazi Germany and in some ways change the war's trajectory. Its target was not a battalion or a base, it was a person, a leader whose capture could shift the balance of power in Europe. In the shadows of the British government, a covert operation was being orchestrated. It was dubbed Operation Dynamo. The mission was designed to rescue a key political figure who had been captured by the Nazis. This individual wasn't just another prisoner of war. He was a high-profile leader with the potential to rally the oppressed European nations under Nazi control, strengthening the Axis powers' influence across the continent. If he were to remain in enemy hands, it could prove disastrous for Britain's efforts to regain control of Europe. Churchill, ever the strategist, knew that losing this leader to the enemy would be a blow Britain could not afford. But the mission was fraught with peril. The man they were rescuing had been captured in the heart of Nazi-occupied territory. His whereabouts were unknown, and the German forces guarding him were among the most elite in the Reich. The odds were stacked against the British forces. Yet Churchill, against all conventional military advice, approved the operation. "We cannot afford to fail," he said, his words resonating with the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. If this rescue failed, not only would Britain lose a key figure, but it could lose its last hope in the war. The mission began with a gathering of a small but skilled team, an elite force of commandos, intelligence officers, and covert operatives who would embark on a treacherous journey to enemy territory. With every step of their journey, they were pursued by Nazi forces, who had already begun to suspect that a rescue attempt was underway. Their movements were swift, their actions quiet, but their mission was anything but simple. As they crossed the perilous landscapes of occupied Europe, the fear of discovery was ever present. One wrong move could lead to a catastrophic failure. As the team approached their objective, the tension was palpable. This wasn't a typical military operation with clear battle lines. It was a stealth operation, one that required the team to blend into the shadows, to move unseen, and to rely on the element of surprise. Every step taken was a step closer to danger, and the closer they got to their target, the more vulnerable they became. The team, despite their nerves, knew the stakes. They were not just rescuing a leader, they were rescuing the future of Britain and, by extension, the future of Europe. On the eve of the operation, as the team prepared to infiltrate the Nazi stronghold, Churchill sat in the solitude of his office, cigar in hand, gazing over the map of Europe. He knew that the rescue mission was their last chance at changing the tide of the war. The success of the mission would send a clear message to both the Allies and the Axis powers. Britain was still standing, still fighting, and still capable of outsmarting the Nazis. The world needed to see that Britain could not be defeated. That was the true mission, not just the rescue but the preservation of Britain's will to fight. As dawn broke on the day of the rescue, the team launched their operation. The mission was fraught with intense firefights, close calls, and narrow escapes. But against the odds, they succeeded in their objective. The leader, once a prisoner of war, was freed and whisked away to safety. The mission, though it had taken everything from the operatives involved, was a resounding success. The world would not know the details for years to come, but the repercussions of this rescue were felt immediately. Britain had, once again, proven its resilience. Churchill's secret mission, though overshadowed by the grandeur of the war itself, marked a pivotal moment in the fight against Nazi tyranny. It was not just a military victory, it was a testament to Britain's willpower, to its refusal to bow before the darkness of tyranny. As Churchill later remarked, "Sometimes the most important victories are the ones fought in silence." The world may have never known the full scope of Operation Dynamo, but the operation was a reminder to the world, and to Churchill himself, that when Britain faced a crisis, it would always rise to the occasion. The mission may have been classified, but its significance echoed through the halls of history. The rescued leader would go on to play a pivotal role in uniting the fractured nations of Europe, pushing back against the Nazi stranglehold. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were still rays of hope. And for Winston Churchill, the architect of this secret mission, it was a personal victory, one that showed he was still capable of delivering the impossible, even when the stakes were at their highest. Britain had not just survived the war, it had thrived. And Churchill, once again, had secured his place in history as the man who would never let his country fall. By 1941, Winston Churchill's victory in the Battle of Britain seemed like a monumental achievement. Yet, despite this triumph, Britain faced an exhausting reality. They were not just fighting for survival but for the future of Europe itself. Churchill understood that every victory cost lives, and the price of victory in this war was becoming increasingly clear. The Blitz had taken its toll on British civilians, cities had been reduced to rubble and resources were rapidly running out. The sheer devastation across the country was felt in every corner, from the bombed-out streets of London to the dwindling food supplies that were stretched to the breaking point. Britain was enduring the unthinkable, and the constant barrage of enemy bombs left a psychological scar that was as deep as any wound. The British people had learned to endure. In fact, it was their resilience that Churchill relied on the most. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, he had famously declared after the Battle of Britain. But the truth was, even the stoic British spirit had its limits. The population was becoming war-weary, and the cost of Churchill's promises was starting to weigh heavily on the government. Still, Churchill's resolve never faltered. He had a vision, a deep and unwavering belief that the survival of Britain was more than a matter of military might. It was a matter of belief, unity, and the indefatigable spirit of the people. But even Churchill's iron will was tested in these early days. The financial burden of the war was mounting. Supplies were scarce, industry was in overdrive, and the British Empire, which had once spanned the globe, was crumbling under the weight of its own losses. It was clear that, to win this war, Churchill would need more than just a brilliant mind for strategy. He would need the world to believe in him, to rally behind a vision that stretched beyond the battlefield. He had already set in motion the secret rescue mission, but what was really at stake was much more profound. While Europe teetered on the brink of total domination by Nazi forces, Britain, despite its hardships, was starting to win key battles. Yet, Churchill was aware that it wasn't enough to merely win militarily, they needed to win the narrative. The war was not only a fight for territory, but for the hearts and minds of the nations that would eventually shape the post-war world. Churchill understood that without an ally, a key political figure, in the heart of Nazi territory, Britain might soon find itself isolated in a Europe dominated by fascism. The secret mission to rescue this leader had become one of the cornerstones of his vision. But as the days wore on, Churchill knew that every moment spent in Nazi hands meant that Britain's survival was further at risk. In the corridors of power, whispers spread about Churchill's plans. His ministers at times questioned whether the operation was worth the cost. The military resources required for such a daring rescue could be used elsewhere, and Britain's defenses were already stretched thin. However, Churchill stood firm. His belief in the mission went beyond logic, it was about the symbolic nature of the operation. If Britain could pull off such a high-stakes rescue, it would send a message to both allies and adversaries. Britain was not finished. Their resolve was unbreakable. For Churchill, the operation was more than an act of military strategy. It was a declaration of defiance against the seemingly unstoppable rise of Nazi Germany. With each passing day, the stakes became even more personal. Churchill had no illusions about the danger his operatives faced. If the mission failed, not only would Britain lose a vital leader, but it would lose any remaining hope of European unity. The Nazi war machine was relentless, and if they could capture such a figure, they would likely use him as a propaganda tool to consolidate their grip over occupied Europe. For Churchill, losing this leader to the Nazis would not just be a military setback, it would be a defeat of moral proportions. The British people, already struggling to hold on to hope, needed a victory that transcended military achievements. They needed a victory that could be felt in their hearts, one that demonstrated that no matter the cost, Britain would continue to fight. And so, as the secret rescue operation moved closer to execution, Churchill continued to lead Britain with unparalleled determination. The cost of victory was undeniable, but Churchill's refusal to abandon the mission was a reflection of his core belief, that Britain would not just survive, it would thrive. Even when the war was at its darkest, Churchill's leadership was the guiding light, keeping the nation anchored in its greatest hour of need. The mission, now in its final stages, required a level of precision that seemed impossible. The operatives, led by seasoned military intelligence officers, were placed under immense pressure. They had no room for error. Their task was to enter enemy territory, navigate the heavily fortified lines of Nazi soldiers, and extract the leader. It was a seemingly impossible feat, one that no rational strategist would undertake under such dire circumstances. The risks were high, the possibility of failure overwhelming. But Churchill's unflinching belief in the mission gave his operatives the courage to act, to fight through the very real dangers and move with a quiet desperation that only those with everything to lose can understand. As the operatives infiltrated the enemy lines, the secrecy of the mission made it even more perilous. They had to move swiftly, carefully, and undetected. The shadow of the Nazis loomed over every step, and every creaking floorboard or distant sound could give them away. Yet, despite the odds, the team found themselves inching closer to their goal. With every passing hour, the urgency intensified. Each minute that passed was another step closer to either failure or an unprecedented triumph. The balance of Europe, it seemed, was on the knife's edge. Throughout the mission, Churchill's mind remained focused. Every day he received reports, constantly adjusting his strategy based on new intelligence. He knew that there could be no delay, no hesitation. The moment they failed, the consequences would be devastating. The danger of discovery was immense, but the potential for success was equally significant. This mission was more than just about saving one man, it was about saving Britain from the very real possibility of defeat. It was about standing up to tyranny in a way that no other nation could. As the mission approached its climax, Churchill's faith never wavered. The night before the operation's final phase, he gave a speech to his cabinet. "Our victory will not just be measured in land or in warships. It will be measured in the hearts of the oppressed people of Europe. They will know that we fought for them. And that, my friends, is a victory no force can take from us." His words were filled with conviction, a conviction that would drive the operatives on the ground to push through the final hurdles that stood in their way. It was a mission that, despite the odds, Britain could not afford to fail. At the moment of extraction, when the leader was finally freed from the clutches of the enemy, the operatives knew they had succeeded. But their victory, like most in war, was bittersweet. The cost had been heavy, the risks unimaginable. Yet, in that moment, the world would not know of their success for years to come. All that mattered was that the mission had been accomplished, and with it, Churchill had secured not just a victory for Britain, but a moral triumph for the free world. The rescue mission had succeeded, and the world did not yet know the full scale of what had transpired. The mission, codenamed Operation Dynamo, would be kept a closely guarded secret. Yet, the results were immediately felt in both Britain and Europe. The leader who had been captured was freed, and with his release came a renewed sense of hope. For the people of Europe, especially those living under Nazi oppression, the mission symbolized a turning point. It was proof that Britain was not only surviving, it was fighting back, and it had the means to strike at the heart of the enemy. The leader's return to British-controlled territory was marked by a quiet, yet powerful, celebration. It wasn't just the return of one man, it was the return of a symbol of resistance. This man's role would go on to play a pivotal part in uniting the European resistance against the Nazis. His leadership would be key in the years to come, providing much-needed hope to those living under occupation. His rescue by the British was a message to every nation under Nazi control, that the war was not over and that the Allies were not finished yet. Churchill, though cautious in his optimism, knew that this mission had altered the trajectory of the war. It wasn't just about the leader's release, it was about what it represented. It was a victory of willpower, a victory of belief. Britain had not just fought for survival, it had fought for the freedom of every occupied country. It had given the world a reason to hope, even in the darkest times. But as the war progressed, Churchill continued to face the grim realities of a world still at war. The battles were far from over, and the mission, though a success, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Yet, for the moment, Britain had won a vital victory, a victory that would send ripples across the war-torn continents. This was a victory not just of arms but of spirit. Churchill had secured Britain's place at the table of post-war Europe, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose for the Allies in their fight against the Axis powers. The success of the mission did more than just secure a leader's freedom. It showed the world that Britain could still lead, could still fight, and could still inspire those who were desperately holding on to the hope of liberation. And in that moment, Churchill's belief in the importance of this mission had been fully vindicated. The mission had been Britain's triumph, but it would become the world's salvation. In the wake of Operation Dynamo's success, the impact was immediate but subtle. Churchill knew that the full significance of the mission would not be felt for years to come, but for the moment, Britain had reclaimed a semblance of its former grandeur. The rescue had served more than just a tactical purpose. It was a statement of defiance, a reminder to both the Axis powers and the occupied nations of Europe that Britain had not been broken. The operation gave the British people a glimmer of hope, the belief that even when victory seemed impossible, Britain could still strike with precision and courage. As news of the rescue operation filtered through the back channels of Allied intelligence, it began to stir the hearts of people living under Nazi oppression. Across Europe, resistance groups that had once been fractured and disillusioned found new energy in the news of the operation's success. The message was clear: Britain was still a beacon of resistance, and the Nazi grip on Europe was not as invincible as it seemed. The rescue had not only preserved the life of an important leader, it had reignited the spark of resistance in occupied Europe. This was more than just a tactical win, it was a moral victory for those who had held on to the hope of liberation. Churchill, ever the strategist, understood the importance of maintaining that spark. Behind the scenes, he worked tirelessly to strengthen the connections between the British government and the various resistance movements operating throughout Europe. He knew that the war was far from won and that the fight against Nazi domination would require the combined efforts of all the occupied nations. This was not a battle Britain could win alone. It would take every European resistance fighter, every underground cell, and every group of partisans to keep the pressure on the Nazis. But Churchill's leadership, symbolized by the secret rescue mission, had provided the catalyst for a new phase in the war, the fight for Europe's soul. The operation, though carefully concealed, became an open secret among the Allies. It was an operation that had cost lives, but the cost of failure would have been far greater. The man who had been rescued was a symbol, a leader who, once freed, could unite the fragmented resistance forces scattered across Europe. His return to Britain was not just a personal victory, it was a rallying cry for the oppressed. His escape from Nazi custody had proven that the fight for freedom was not a lost cause, and that the spirit of defiance could still stand tall in the face of tyranny. It was a reminder that, no matter how dire the situation seemed, the war was not over. The Allies had the power to turn the tide. Churchill too took great pride in the operation. Yet, despite his satisfaction, he remained aware of the delicate balance he had to maintain. The political ramifications of such a mission were profound. He knew that if word of the operation reached the wrong hands, if the mission were revealed prematurely, the repercussions could threaten the delicate alliances that had been forged between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The stakes of global diplomacy were as high as those on the battlefield. Churchill's success was not just about military operations, it was about ensuring that the foundations of post-war peace were secure. Every maneuver, every secret mission, had to be carefully calculated in the larger context of the Allies' strategy. In private, Churchill often remarked that Britain's survival depended not just on defeating the enemy, but on its ability to outlast the war itself. The rescue mission had been a testament to Britain's resilience, but it was only one part of a larger, more complex struggle. As the war in Europe raged on, Churchill's mind never stopped planning for the aftermath. He knew that the real victory would not come with the defeat of the Axis powers alone. The true challenge lay in ensuring that the world that emerged from the war would be shaped by the values of freedom, democracy, and justice. That vision was as crucial to Britain's survival as the military campaigns. For now, however, Britain's focus was on the war at hand. The Nazi war machine had been significantly weakened, but it was far from defeated. The success of the rescue mission had been a much-needed boost to morale, but Churchill knew that Britain could not rest on its laurels. The true test would come when the Allies began to mount their counteroffensive across Europe. It would take all of Britain's resources and every ounce of its spirit to keep pushing forward. The mission had been a victory, but it had also marked the beginning of a larger struggle, one that would determine the future of Europe and the world. As the months passed, the reverberations of the rescue mission were felt across Europe. Resistance movements grew bolder, inspired by the knowledge that a single act of courage could make a difference. The Nazis, who had once believed their control over Europe was unshakable, now had to confront the reality that Britain, and the free nations of the world, were more determined than ever to bring an end to their reign of terror. The war, Churchill knew, was not just a contest of armies, it was a battle for the soul of Europe. The secret mission to rescue a leader, though small in the grand scheme of things, had proven that when the time came, Britain would be ready to fight, in any way at any cost. And so, as the war continued, Churchill's secret rescue mission remained a quiet, yet, in the months following the success of Operation Dynamo, Britain began to feel the weight of its success. The rescue mission had brought new hope, but that hope had come at a high price. While the nation rallied behind Churchill, buoyed by the victory of saving one of their own, the underlying cost of the operation soon became apparent. The burden of secrecy, the danger, and the effort it took to pull off such an audacious plan began to take its toll on those who had been closest to the mission. The operatives who had carried out the rescue were sworn to secrecy, their names never to be spoken, their actions never to be revealed. Yet, in the quiet of their homes, many of them grappled with the aftermath. They had risked everything, lives, families, and futures, to complete the mission. And though their success had been celebrated by Churchill and the British public, the personal consequences for many involved were profound. Some struggled with the psychological toll of what they had endured, the constant fear, the narrow escapes, the friends lost in the chaos. Others, like the leader they had rescued, now found themselves walking in a world where they were constantly haunted by the shadows of their past. For Churchill, the operation's success had solidified his position as a leader of unparalleled tenacity, but it had also forced him into a paradox. He had orchestrated a daring, life-risking mission that demonstrated Britain's enduring resolve. Yet, for all the triumph, there were whispers in the halls of power about the secrecy of it all. How far was Britain willing to go for such victories? How many more secret operations could the country carry out without risking its political and moral standing in the world? The very nature of such covert missions placed a strain on Churchill's conscience and his leadership. As the months turned into years, the secrecy surrounding the operation grew more burdensome. Churchill, though committed to the mission and its objectives, began to feel the personal isolation that came with leading a war effort from the shadows. The sacrifices made by so many for the sake of this operation, and others like it, were known only to a small circle. The weight of that secrecy began to seep into his daily life, affecting his health and his relationships. His staff, though fiercely loyal, could not help but notice the increasing signs of exhaustion and weariness in their leader. Churchill, who had once been a picture of indomitable energy, now appeared drained, more reflective, and at times even melancholic. In public he still stood as the towering symbol of Britain's fight against tyranny. His speeches rang with the fervor of a man who knew his country's survival was on his shoulders. But behind the words, the reality of the toll the war, and his secret missions, had taken on him was becoming evident. The constant pressure to deliver victories, to maintain unity, and to execute covert operations had led to sleepless nights and deep anxiety. Churchill, ever the strategist, knew that his leadership was indispensable. Yet he also began to understand that every victory, every covert mission, came at a personal cost. The mission had saved a leader and revived the hopes of a nation, but at the same time, it had deepened the shadows around Churchill himself. Despite these personal challenges, Churchill continued to lead Britain with unrelenting determination. The war, after all, was not over. The rescue mission had been a key victory, but the true test was yet to come. The war was entering its most crucial phase. The Allies had begun to push back the Axis powers, and the time was fast approaching for the great invasions that would mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Churchill, ever the realist, knew that Britain's role in the coming stages of the war would be critical. The mission had been one piece in a much larger puzzle, and its success had given the Allies the much-needed momentum they would need for the coming challenges. However, the quiet that followed the success of the operation was deceptive. While the rescue had delivered a major moral boost, the day-to-day struggle for survival continued. Britain was still a nation beset by scarcity, by bombing raids, and by the looming threat of an invasion that was far from being averted. The people, while inspired by the rescue, were beginning to feel the limits of their endurance. The streets of London still bore the scars of the Blitz. Families lived under constant threat of bombings, food was rationed, and the overall sense of security was still fragile. Churchill's rescue mission had given Britain a reason to believe, but it had not given them an escape from the war's unrelenting grind. In the midst of all this, Churchill had to balance the expectations of his people with the reality of the war. His leadership had been vital in keeping Britain's morale high, but even he could not escape the long-lasting strain that such a constant, unyielding conflict had placed on his mind. The people of Britain, who had once hung on every word of his speeches, were beginning to yearn for the end of the war. They were tired of the air raids, of the uncertainty, and of the heavy toll the war had exacted on their lives. Churchill knew that victory in the war was still possible, but he also knew that the peace that would follow would require a new vision, one that would lift Britain from the ashes of destruction and lead it into a future that had not yet been imagined. The secret mission, while a remarkable success, was not the ultimate answer to Britain's problems. It had saved one man, but it could not save the. As the war raged on, Winston Churchill's place at the helm of Britain remained unshaken, but the landscape of both the conflict and his leadership was shifting. The successful rescue mission, which had initially brought a wave of optimism, had proven to be only one chapter in a much larger, more complex story. Britain had faced the horrors of war, but it now stood on the precipice of what seemed like an endless struggle. The shadows of the Blitz had not yet cleared, and the hardships of rationing and bombardment still gripped the British public. Yet even in the heart of adversity, Churchill remained a beacon of hope, a man whose resolve seemed unwavering, but whose internal battles were becoming ever more pronounced. In the summer of 1941, as the Allies prepared for the decisive battles that would shape the outcome of the war, Churchill found himself confronted by a new set of challenges. While his earlier triumphs, both in the air and on the diplomatic stage, had kept Britain from breaking, it was becoming apparent that the war was no longer solely about military victories. It was about the preservation of Britain's very soul. And as the secret mission demonstrated, Britain's strength lay not just in its ability to defeat the enemy, but in its ability to inspire. Churchill's words had galvanized millions during the darkest days, but the sheer weight of the war, coupled with the deepening toll it took on every facet of life, was beginning to fracture the unity he had so carefully cultivated. Churchill's resilience at times seemed indestructible, but the cracks were beginning to show. His health was faltering, his mind clouded by sleepless nights and the enormous responsibility he bore. The tension between his public persona as a leader and his private struggles was beginning to take a toll on those closest to him. His family, though fiercely loyal, could see the strain. His wife, Clementine, became increasingly concerned as Churchill withdrew further into his own thoughts, consumed by the war and the decisions that could alter the course of history. "Winston," she gently reminded him, "you cannot carry the weight of the world alone." But Churchill's response was always the same: "I must." He had always known that his destiny was tied to the fate of Britain, and in his heart, he believed that only he could lead the nation to victory. Yet, despite his unwavering belief in his role, Churchill knew that the mission had marked a turning point in the war, a turning point that would not just define Britain's future but his own. The mission had been a testament to Britain's indomitable will, but the true test was now at hand. The Allies' strategy was shifting, and as Churchill turned his attention to the coming battles, it became clear that the war was evolving in ways that demanded more than military might. It demanded unity, cooperation, and a willingness to look beyond the immediate goals of military victory and toward the larger task of rebuilding a broken world. In private moments, Churchill reflected on the sacrifices that had been made, not just by the soldiers on the front lines, but by the civilians who had borne the brunt of the conflict. He had been, in many ways, the voice that had held Britain together, but he understood that leadership was not just about commanding armies or making speeches. It was about listening, about understanding the needs of the people, and about shaping the post-war world. The success of the rescue mission, while a symbolic triumph, had only reaffirmed the undeniable truth: Britain's future would be determined by more than military victories. The nation's strength would come from its ability to rebuild its spirit, to renew its commitment to freedom and democracy in the face of unimaginable hardship. As the Allies began to turn the tide in North Africa, the mood in Britain shifted again. The emotional weight of the mission had lifted some of the burden of isolation, but new challenges loomed on the horizon. The entry of the United States into the war following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a pivotal moment. Britain had long relied on the support of its allies, but now, with America's involvement, the balance of power in the war was changing. Churchill's once solitary leadership was now tempered by the need for a new alliance, one that would require delicate diplomacy, compromise, and coordination. Churchill, always a master of oratory and strategy, found himself in the unfamiliar position of being part of a broader coalition. The mission to rescue the leader had been carried out in secrecy, and its success had reaffirmed Britain's ability to lead in the shadows. But now, Churchill had to learn how to share the stage with new players on the world stage, each with their own agendas and priorities. As he met with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, Churchill found himself balancing the roles of mediator, negotiator, and strategist. The war was no longer just Britain's battle, it was a global struggle, and the stakes were far higher than anyone had anticipated. Yet, even in the face of these monumental shifts, Churchill held firm to his belief that Britain's role in the post-war world was non-negotiable. The success of the secret mission had proven that Britain could still strike decisively, but now, it would need to adapt to a new, more complex world order. Churchill's vision for the future of Europe and the world was increasingly focused on the principles of democracy, freedom, and the protection of nations from totalitarianism. He recognized that the battle against Nazi Germany was not just a fight for territory, but for the very values that defined the Allied cause. And though the war was far from over, Churchill understood that the peace to follow would be just as important as the victory itself. As the year 1942 unfolded, Churchill continued to guide Britain through its darkest days. The shadows of war were still ever present, but the resolve of the British people had been renewed by the success of the rescue operation. The mission, though long classified, had inspired a sense of unity and purpose that transcended the devastation. It was a reminder that Britain, no matter how grim the circumstances, would never surrender. Churchill's leadership had cemented his place as the guiding force. By 1943, as the war continued to unfold with brutal intensity across Europe and the Pacific, Winston Churchill found himself at a crossroads. The secret rescue mission, though a resounding success, had come at a heavy price, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the strain it placed on his leadership. With Britain's survival now in the hands of a larger Allied coalition, Churchill was forced to navigate a shifting political landscape. While the military victories were being won, the burden of rebuilding Europe, and perhaps more significantly Britain, lay ahead. Churchill had, by then, become a symbol of Britain's resistance, a living testament to the nation's ability to endure. But even heroes are not immune to the relentless pressure of history. Throughout 1943, Churchill's focus was drawn towards the growing realization that Britain's post-war role would not simply be determined by the outcomes of the military engagements, but by the deep, underlying shifts that were reshaping global politics. With the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as the dominant superpowers, Britain, while vital, was finding its role in the post-war world less certain. The success of the rescue mission, which had provided a much-needed rallying point for Britain's resistance, now seemed like a temporary victory in a far larger struggle for power and influence. The leaders of the New World Order, Roosevelt and Stalin, held the keys to shaping the future, and Churchill had to decide how to navigate this new reality while keeping Britain at the forefront. As the Allies planned their next moves, Churchill's once unchallenged position as Britain's wartime leader began to show signs of vulnerability. The public, who had cheered him through the Blitz and trusted him with the nation's fate, were growing weary. Victory, though now a tangible goal, was still distant, and the scars of the war were beginning to show in every corner of British life. The morale of the nation, once fueled by the belief that Churchill would lead them to ultimate triumph, was starting to fray. With every military setback, the cracks in Britain's war effort became more visible. The war had lasted longer than anyone had expected, and the toll on the country was becoming unsustainable. Yet, Churchill could not afford to show weakness, and the mission's success had only intensified the pressure on him to maintain Britain's role as a global leader. By 1944, as the Allies pushed into France with the D-Day landings, the war's trajectory began to shift dramatically in their favor. But for Churchill, the war was no longer simply about defeating the enemy. It had become a battle for Britain's identity in a world that was changing irrevocably. The rescue mission had proven that Britain was capable of extraordinary acts of courage and resolve. But now, the challenge was to ensure that those qualities would continue to guide the nation in the aftermath of the war. Churchill's vision for a post-war Britain was one of peace and prosperity, but it would require more than military victories to make it a reality. Britain's survival, Churchill understood, depended on its ability to adapt to the New World Order. The strain of this realization weighed heavily on Churchill's shoulders. Despite his indomitable spirit, he was becoming acutely aware of the limitations of his own power. He had always believed in the exceptionalism of Britain, but the new balance of power was shifting away from the old imperial system that had sustained Britain for centuries. As the war neared its end, Churchill found himself increasingly grappling with the idea that the post-war world would not be the one he had envisioned when he first took office. The mission to rescue the leader had been a victory, but it was also a reminder that nothing, not even the most brilliant military strategies or covert operations, could shield Britain from the rapid changes taking place in the global order. In this period of uncertainty, Churchill's attention turned inward. He began to focus more on the challenges Britain would face in the immediate aftermath of the war. The rebuilding of cities, the care for returning soldiers, the restoration of a nation torn apart by years of conflict. And while these were monumental challenges, Churchill's mind was also preoccupied with the legacy he would leave behind. He had led Britain through its darkest hours, but the war was nearing its end. What would be his place in the future of the world? Would Britain, the nation he had fought for so fiercely, be able to retain its position as a global power? Or would it be relegated to the sidelines, overshadowed by the rising influence of the United States and the Soviet Union? For Churchill, the burden of legacy was both a source of strength and a source of deep anxiety. His place in history seemed assured, as the leader who had guided Britain through the horrors of war and emerged victorious. But what of the future? The legacy of his wartime leadership was unquestioned, but the future of Britain was still uncertain. The secret mission, though successful, had been a moment of brilliance in an otherwise tumultuous period. As Churchill looked toward the post-war years, he found himself wrestling with the realization that his vision for the future was rapidly becoming a dream of the past. The world was changing too quickly, and the forces of history were now beyond his control. Despite these inner conflicts, Churchill's public leadership never wavered. He continued to fight for Britain's place in the post-war order, striving to maintain the country's influence in the face of the emerging Cold War. He fought to secure Britain's position at the table of the New World Order, but with the increasing power of the United States and the Soviet Union, he knew that Britain's role would be limited. It was in these final years of the war that Churchill's sense of purpose, and his role in the history of Britain, would begin to evolve. He had once seen Britain as the leader of the free world, but now he understood that the post-war world would be shaped by a broader set of forces, ones that extended far beyond Britain's grasp. In private, Churchill's reflections on his legacy were often tinged with a quiet melancholy. His victories, though immense, were no longer enough to define his place in history. He had led Britain through its darkest hours, and his leadership had saved the nation from the brink of collapse. But now, as the war neared its conclusion, Churchill's thoughts turned to what would follow. Would Britain, after all the sacrifices, be able to thrive in a world that had outgrown the old imperial order? Would his vision for a prosperous, democratic Britain survive the turbulent changes that lay ahead? The answer, he realized, would depend not just on military might or strategic brilliance, but on the resilience of the British people themselves. As Churchill turned his gaze toward the future, he knew that the war was nearing its end, but the challenges of rebuilding the world would only just begin. The mission had been a success, but it was no longer enough. As 1945 dawned, the war in Europe was coming to a victorious close. The Allies had pushed back Nazi forces on all fronts, and the end of the conflict was almost within reach. Yet for Winston Churchill, the end of the war did not bring the relief he had so long anticipated. Victory had been hard-earned, and though the public celebrated, Churchill felt a deep sense of foreboding. The war had not only altered the landscape of Europe but had irrevocably changed the world itself. The operations, the sacrifices, and the difficult decisions he had made were now being overshadowed by a new, more pressing concern: the post-war world. Despite the successes of the war, Britain's future was far from secure. The mission to rescue a key leader, while a monumental triumph in its own right, had been but one piece of a larger puzzle. Churchill had led Britain through its darkest hour, but now the country was faced with the monumental task of rebuilding itself from the devastation of years of conflict. The streets of London, once filled with bombings and terror, were now filled with hope, but that hope was tempered by the realization that victory alone would not guarantee a prosperous future. For Churchill, the challenges of peace would prove far more complex than the battle for survival. By the summer of 1945, Churchill had already begun to reflect on the future of Britain. The secret rescue mission had shown the world that Britain still possessed the resolve to act decisively, even in its most desperate moments. But as the tide of war turned in favor of the Allies, Churchill knew that the battle for Britain's soul was just beginning. The war had made him a hero, but the post-war world was shaping up to be something entirely different from the one he had envisioned when he first took office. Churchill's wartime success had earned him the affection of the British people, but their hearts were turning to other concerns. The austerity of war, the destruction of cities, the loss of so many young men in battle, these were the realities the public faced. The people of Britain were no longer content with survival alone. They wanted more, they wanted the promise of a better life after the war. And they were looking to their leaders to deliver it. Churchill, the great symbol of Britain's resistance, now found himself caught between the expectations of the nation and the harsh realities of the post-war world. In the days following the defeat of Nazi Germany, the signs of a new political landscape began to emerge. Across Europe and even in Britain itself, the call for social reform grew louder. The Labour Party, which had been in Churchill's shadow for much of the war, began to gain ground. Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, was beginning to position himself as a leader of the future, one who was ready to transform Britain from a country scarred by war into a modern welfare state. For Churchill, this shift in political momentum was both unsettling and inevitable. While he had led Britain through the war, he had always believed in the values of the past, the traditional British virtues of liberty, self-reliance, and imperial pride. But now, in the face of growing calls for change, he realized that the nation was moving in a different direction. The election of 1945 would be a defining moment for Churchill and for Britain. The Labour Party's platform of social reform, free healthcare, housing for all, and greater economic equality, resonated deeply with a population that had endured years of hardship. The mood of the nation had shifted. People were no longer content with mere survival. They wanted to rebuild a society where everyone had a stake in the future. Churchill's vision for post-war Britain, while focused on the restoration of the British Empire and the preservation of its global influence, was increasingly at odds with the hopes of a weary nation. On the campaign trail, Churchill struggled to connect with the new mood of the electorate. His speeches, once filled with defiance and hope, now seemed out of touch with the needs of the people. His warning that Labour's policies would lead to a Gestapo to enforce socialism was met with disbelief and derision. To many, Churchill's rhetoric seemed like the voice of a bygone era, one that could no longer speak to the needs of a war-weary, post-war Britain. Labour's call for a fairer, more equal society struck a chord with voters, and on July 5, 1945, the British people delivered a stunning verdict. The result of the election was nothing short of a political earthquake. The Labour Party won a landslide victory, and Churchill, the man who had led Britain through its darkest days, found himself ousted from power. The people had spoken, and they had chosen a different vision for the future. The man who had been Britain's greatest hero in the war now faced the harsh reality that his vision for the nation's future was no longer what the people desired. It was a stunning reversal of fortune, one that would shake Churchill to his core. For Churchill, the defeat was deeply painful. He had never expected to lose the election, and the result left him reeling. His wife, Clementine, would later recall that her husband was deeply hurt by the loss, not out of anger but from a sense of sadness and betrayal. To Churchill, the defeat was not just a personal blow, it was a reflection of a Britain he no longer recognized. The country he had fought to save from tyranny now seemed intent on moving away from the values he had cherished. The post-war world, with its new priorities of social welfare and equality, seemed foreign to him. In the days after the election, Churchill retreated to his country home at Chartwell, away from the noise of the political world. There he spent his time reflecting on the election results and his place in history. He knew that the war had been his greatest triumph, but now he had to confront the uncomfortable truth that the Britain of the future might not be the Britain he had envisioned. The secret mission, the rescue of the leader, the victories in Europe, these were his legacy, but now he had to come to terms with the fact that the world had moved on. For Churchill, the post-war years would be marked by a new challenge. In the years following his electoral defeat, Winston Churchill found himself at a crossroads. His resounding triumph during the war, which had made him a towering figure in British and world history, seemed almost like a distant memory. The post-war world was moving forward, and for all his wartime accolades, Churchill now stood on the outside, watching as new ideas began to take root in Britain. The country had voted for change, and the Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, was at the helm, pushing forward with a bold agenda for social reform. But even as the Labour government set about reshaping Britain, Churchill, though momentarily silenced, was not finished. His time had not yet passed. The pain of losing the 1945 election was acute, but Churchill, ever the politician, quickly understood that defeat in the political arena did not equate to defeat in the hearts of the people. As he had done throughout his life, he accepted the loss, not with resignation but with resolve. If the people of Britain wanted change, he would respect their will, but he would not step aside quietly. He had not fought so hard through the war only to let the world move on without him. His battle was far from over, and Churchill knew that he had a significant role to play in the post-war world, even if it wasn't immediately obvious how that would unfold. In 1946, Churchill began to speak out once again, not as Prime Minister, but as the leader of the opposition. His voice was still powerful, his speeches still filled with the cadence of history. He railed against Labour's socialist policies, warning that the very fabric of Britain's identity would be torn apart by the state's growing control over everyday life. Though Labour had won the election with a promise to deliver social welfare and nationalisation, Churchill's belief in individual liberty, free enterprise, and the rights of the British people to maintain their independence was unwavering. His opposition to Labour's nationalisation of key industries became the cornerstone of his return to the political fray. Despite the growing influence of the Labour government, Churchill's message resonated with many. He spoke of the greatness of Britain, the importance of individual responsibility, and the need to preserve the British Empire. These were themes that had made him a hero during the war, and they were still deeply ingrained in his vision for the future. However, as the years passed and Britain's place in the world continued to evolve, Churchill's ideas began to sound more like those of an elder statesman, clinging to a vision of the past. The winds of change, however, were relentless. Britain's empire was in decline, and its future would be shaped by new forces that Churchill could not control. Yet, in 1951, a shift began to take place. The Labour government, despite its ambitious reforms, found itself struggling with the weight of post-war austerity, inflation, and a growing dissatisfaction among the British people. The public, though appreciative of Labour's post-war welfare state, began to grow weary of the economic difficulties that came with it. Housing shortages, rationing, and economic stagnation created a sense of disillusionment. As these challenges mounted, the British people began to reconsider their options. While Labour's promises had resonated during the immediate post-war years, the reality of its implementation was far more complicated. The mood of the nation was shifting, and as it did, so too did Churchill's fortunes. Churchill, now in his late 70s, returned to power in 1951, when the Conservative Party won the general election in a stunning reversal. It was a remarkable comeback for the man who had once led Britain through its darkest days and had then been cast aside in the post-war years. The 1951 victory, while not as overwhelming as his earlier triumphs, marked a pivotal moment in his political career. His return to Downing Street, albeit as an older, more reflective leader, was an affirmation of his enduring influence in British politics. He was no longer the firebrand of the war years, but he was still Winston Churchill, the man who had steered Britain through its most perilous moments. His second term as Prime Minister was marked by a more cautious approach. The fire of his earlier years had dimmed, but the wisdom that came with age and experience became apparent. Churchill's focus shifted toward stabilizing the British economy and navigating the challenges of a world that was growing ever more interconnected. The Cold War loomed large, and Britain's role in the international order had changed. The empire was crumbling, and Britain was no longer the unquestioned global power it had once been. Churchill, however, remained a staunch advocate for Britain's place in the world and worked to ensure that his nation would not be relegated to irrelevance. In this second act of his political life, Churchill's leadership was characterized by pragmatism rather than the bold, sweeping gestures of his earlier years. He recognized that the world was changing, and that Britain's role in it had to be recalibrated. He continued to push for a strong relationship with the United States and maintained a firm stance on the importance of democracy and the protection of individual freedoms. However, the policies he implemented were more in tune with the realities of a post-war Britain that was facing an inevitable decline in global power. In this sense, Churchill's second term was marked by a delicate balance between preserving Britain's traditional strengths and adapting to a rapidly changing world. For many, Churchill's return to power in 1951 was seen as a final, symbolic victory. The great leader of the past had returned to help guide Britain through its transition into the modern world. He may have been a relic of an older time, but his leadership in the post-war years proved that his vision for Britain, even as the empire faded, still had relevance. Churchill's final years in power were quieter, but they were no less significant. They represented the final chapter in the story of a man whose legacy had already been etched in history, and yet whose influence continued to shape the future. Though his time in office was shorter than many had hoped, Churchill's impact on the post-war world cannot be overstated. His return to power, despite the passage of time and the changing tides of history, was a testament to the enduring power of his leadership. He had led Britain through war, and now he helped guide it through the turbulent years of peace. His comeback was not just about politics. Churchill's resurgence was not merely about reclaiming power. It was about making peace with the changes of the world and finding a way for Britain to navigate them with dignity and strength. As he entered his twilight years, he understood that his time in power was coming to an end, but the essence of his leadership, his fierce love for Britain, his unwavering belief in its place in the world, would continue to resonate long after he had left office. And in his final moments as Prime Minister, as he looked back on the turbulent decades of his life, Winston Churchill knew that his legacy was secure, not just in his victories, but in the hearts of the people who had never forgotten the man who led them to victory in their darkest hours. As Winston Churchill's second term as Prime Minister drew to a close in 1955, the world he had known, and in many ways shaped, seemed to be slipping away from him. The British Empire, once a global colossus, was rapidly disintegrating, its colonies seeking independence at an accelerating pace. Churchill, who had spent his life defending the empire, now found himself confronting the inevitable truth. The world he had fought to preserve was fading into history. It was a realization that weighed heavily on him, and yet, even in his final years, he could not fully abandon the ideals and values that had defined his long political career. The years following his resignation were a time of deep reflection for Churchill. At the age of 80, he withdrew from active political life, but not from the public eye. His presence, though less frequent, was still commanding. His speeches, when they came, carried the weight of a man who had lived through 2 world wars, who had seen the rise and fall of empires, and who had shaped the fate of nations. But as the years went on, the reality of Britain's changing position in the world settled in. The nation, now living in the shadow of the United States and the Soviet Union, was no longer the global powerhouse it had once been. The ghosts of Britain's former greatness haunted Churchill, and as he reflected on his life, there was a deep melancholy in his words, an understanding that even the mightiest empires must eventually give way to the forces of history. In his later years, Churchill's public appearances became increasingly rare, but when he did speak, it was with the voice of a man who knew that his time had passed. The speeches that had once roused nations now felt like echoes of a time that could never be recaptured. Yet even in retirement, Churchill's legacy continued to cast a long shadow over the world. His role in securing Britain's victory in World War II remained unquestioned, but the man who had fought so fiercely for the survival of the empire now found himself grappling with the disintegration of that very empire. The colonies that had once been so firmly under Britain's control were gaining independence, and Churchill, ever the realist, had to accept that Britain's role in the world would no longer be as it once was. It was during this period of reflection that Churchill turned to painting. In the quiet moments as he wandered the gardens of his country home at Chartwell, he found solace in the brush and canvas. Painting became a way for him to express emotions that he had never fully articulated in his speeches or writings. The landscapes he created, full of water, sky, and the soft hues of nature, stood in stark contrast to the war-torn landscapes of his past. As he painted, Churchill began to let go of the world he had known. The wars, the politics, the battles for empire, they were all fading into the distance. What remained was the act of creating, of leaving behind something that was not shaped by war or conflict, but by peace and personal reflection. Churchill's paintings, though not renowned in the same way as his speeches or political accomplishments, became an important part of his later years. They were a private reflection of a man who had spent his life in the public eye, a man who had led a nation through its darkest hours, but who, in his final years, was searching for a form of peace that had eluded him throughout his career. He often spoke of his paintings as a means of escape, of finding a calm and clarity that had long been absent from his life. "In painting, I forget everything," he would say. "The only thing that matters is the brush, the colors, the sky." But the ghosts of greatness that haunted Churchill were not confined to his reflections on the empire. He was also haunted by the knowledge that his time was running out. As he grew older, the once vibrant figure of Churchill began to slow. His health, which had always been strong, started to betray him. The tremors in his hands became more pronounced, and his memory began to falter. He was still the lion-hearted leader who had defied Hitler, but now, in his 80s, he was facing the inevitable decline that comes with age. His mind, though sharp, was increasingly clouded, and his once indomitable spirit began to fade. As his health deteriorated, Churchill's thoughts turned more frequently to the future of Britain. He had always seen himself as a defender of the nation, but now he understood that the world he had known was passing away. He had led Britain through the storms of war, but now, in the final years of his life, he was coming to terms with the fact that the country he had fought so hard to protect would be different in the future. The rise of the United States and the Soviet Union had altered the geopolitical landscape in ways Churchill had not fully anticipated. And though he had always believed in Britain's greatness, even he could not deny the changing tides of history. Churchill's personal life also began to take on a quiet sadness. His wife, Clementine, remained his closest confidant, and their relation. For Churchill, the ghosts of greatness were not just about the victories he had won or the battles he had fought. They were about the lasting impact of his leadership on Britain and the world. As he reflected on his life, Churchill came to understand that the true measure of greatness was not found in the wars won or the empires built, but in the ability to face the inevitable passage of time with dignity and grace. In his final years, Churchill's greatness lay not in his actions, but in his acceptance of the fact that the world was changing, and that his legacy would live on, not just in the monuments to his victories, but in the spirit of resilience and courage that had defined him. As the 1960s unfolded, Winston Churchill found himself increasingly distanced from the turbulent world he had once shaped. The Britain he had fought to preserve, and the empire he had once led, were now relics of a bygone era. The world was shifting under the pressure of new ideologies, technological revolutions, and the rise of a new global order. Churchill, the man who had defied Hitler and helped steer Britain through its darkest days, had become a figurehead, a living monument to a different time. Yet even in his advanced years he could not escape the weight of his legacy. And as his health continued to decline, so did his ability to reconcile the world of his past with the one he saw unfolding before him. In his final years, Churchill's physical health deteriorated rapidly. The once unyielding figure who had led with tireless energy and ambition found his body betraying him. His hands, once steady in the art of speech and leadership, now trembled. His memory, so sharp during the war, began to fade. Yet despite the frailty of his body, the brilliance of his mind remained intact, though it was often clouded by the fog of age. He became a man caught between the past he had forged and the present that was moving quickly beyond his control. The Churchill of the war years was still there, lurking in the depths of his character, but the harsh realities of age demanded that he adapt to his changing world. Though his influence in the political arena had waned, Churchill's legacy remained ever present. The world still looked to him for wisdom, not for new policies, but for a sense of continuity and guidance. He was still the figurehead of Britain's wartime triumphs, a man whose very name had become synonymous with courage and determination. Yet as he stood at the crossroads of history, Churchill found himself in an odd position, both revered and increasingly irrelevant. The Britain he had known was slipping into the past, and the political tides were being reshaped by forces that were foreign to him. The post-war generation, one that had not lived through the Blitz or the horrors of war, was moving forward with new ideas and ideals, and Churchill could not help but feel like a man out of time. He had spent his life in the heat of battle, both on the front lines of war and in the political arena, but as he entered his twilight years, Churchill began to reflect not on what he had accomplished, but on what he had left behind. The true measure of his greatness, he realized, was not in the battles he had won or the speeches he had given, but in the lasting impact he had on the world. It was not enough to have led Britain to victory over the Nazis. It was not enough to have shaped the post-war order. The measure of a man, Churchill now understood, was in how he navigated the complexities of peace after war, how he reconciled his legacy with the changes that time inevitably brought. The empire he had helped build and protect was crumbling, but it was no longer just the loss of empire that weighed heavily on him. The real challenge, Churchill found, was in coming to terms with the idea that he was no longer the man who could shape events. The world was moving forward without him, and while his name would forever be etched in history, the future belonged to a new generation. This realization did not come easily. For a man whose identity had been so tightly woven into his role as a world leader, the passing of time was a bitter pill to swallow. The torch had been passed, but Churchill, in his heart, knew that he was not ready to let go. In these moments of reflection, Churchill often found solace in his family. His wife, Clementine, remained a constant source of support, a gentle reminder of the love and companionship that had sustained him through decades of political battles. Their relationship, grounded in mutual respect and understanding, had been the anchor he needed in the stormy seas of public life. Their bond, though often tested by the pressures of war and politics, had endured, and in his later years, it was a source of comfort. Clementine's presence was a reminder of the life that had existed outside the public eye, the life that Churchill had lived with his family and loved ones. It was this private world, the one that had nurtured him through his darkest hours, that he turned to as the end of his life drew near. Churchill's legacy was not confined to the victories he had won or the policies he had enacted. It was also shaped by his character, his indomitable spirit, his unwavering belief in the strength of Britain, and his refusal to accept defeat. Even as the world changed around him, he continued to embody the principles of courage, determination, and resilience that had defined his leadership. He was a man who had lived through 2 world wars, who had watched as the world transformed, and yet he remained steadfast in his convictions. But as the years passed, it became clear that his leadership was now a part of history, not of the future. The new world would be shaped by others, and Churchill had to come to terms with the fact that his time had come to an end. His final years were marked by an acceptance of this reality. He no longer sought to shape the future but to reflect on the past, on the triumphs, the defeats, and the legacy that he had created. He spent his time with his family, painting and writing. He completed his war memoirs, ensuring that his story would be told in his own words, his voice preserved for posterity. Churchill had always believed that history would judge him kindly, and in his later years he found peace in the knowledge that his place in history was secure. "History will be kind to me," he once remarked, "for I intend to write it." And he did. The pages of his Churchill died on January 24, 1965, at the age of 90, leaving behind a legacy that would endure for generations. His death marked the end of an era, the end of a life spent fighting for Britain's survival and success. Yet, in the quiet reflection of his final years, Churchill came to understand that his true measure was not in the battles he had fought, but in the indelible mark he had left on history. He had been the leader who had stood firm in the face of tyranny, who had inspired a nation to rise above its darkest hour. His legacy was not just the empire he had once ruled, but the spirit of resilience he had instilled in Britain, a spirit that would carry on long after he was gone. Churchill had faced the ghosts of his past, and in doing so had come to terms with his place in history. The measure of a man, he had learned, is not found in the wars he wins, but in the way he meets the inevitable march of time. And in that measure Churchill was truly great. By the early 1960s, Winston Churchill had entered the final chapter of his life, a chapter marked by the quiet inevitability of old age and the relentless march of time. His health, which had once been the embodiment of indomitable strength, was now beginning to show the cracks of years lived in the service of his country. The tremors in his hands, the fading memory, the diminishing energy, all were signs that the man who had once stood at the helm of Britain, defying the forces of tyranny, was now facing the quiet surrender to nature's inevitable course. But even as his body grew frail, his mind remained sharp, reflecting on the extraordinary life he had led and the legacy he would leave behind. In these years, Churchill's life became a delicate balance between the intense awareness of his mortality and his enduring will to remain active, to remain engaged with the world around him. He no longer sought to influence the political landscape directly, but his presence remained powerful. Even as his health began to fail, he was still Winston Churchill, the man who had once rallied Britain in its darkest hours, whose voice had shaped history. But now, in the privacy of his home, he found himself increasingly surrounded by the peaceful rhythms of life. His gardens at Chartwell, his paintings and his family. The world, once full of the urgency of war and statesmanship, had slowed and so had he. His time, however, was not spent in complete seclusion. Churchill continued to receive dignitaries, offer counsel, and from time to time, lend his voice to the issues of the day. Though he no longer held the power of office, his words still carried weight, and his thoughts on the state of the world were highly sought after. He had always been a man whose presence seemed to transcend the moment. His speeches, even in his later years, rang with the gravitas of history. And when he did speak, it was with the authority of a man who had seen the world shift in ways few could comprehend, and whose actions had irrevocably shaped the course of the 20th century. As he aged, the man who had once been a lion on the world stage began to soften into the reflections of a patriarch. A man who had lived through world wars, who had seen the collapse of an empire and the rise of a new world order. He had led Britain through its darkest days, but now he was contending with the passing of that era. The world had changed, and Churchill, while still a towering figure, was now a witness to that change rather than its architect. The empire he had once defended so fiercely was dissolving, and Britain's place in the world was no longer as dominant as it had once been. His own role had shifted as well, from war leader to elder statesman, from active participant to reflection on a life well lived. In these final years, Churchill found solace in the things that had always brought him peace. His love for painting, his passion for history, and most of all, his family. He spent hours in the gardens of Chartwell, reflecting on the landscapes he had created in both his life and on the canvas. The brush in his hand allowed him to escape into a world of color and form, where the battles of the past were replaced by still waters and golden skies. It was in these quiet moments, surrounded by his loved ones, that Churchill began to reconcile the legacy of his wartime years with the gentler rhythms of his later life. Clementine, his wife and constant companion, was a steady presence by his side, providing him with the support and care he needed in his final years. Their relationship, which had been built on years of mutual respect, was now one of deep emotional connection. Clementine, though in her own later years, remained Churchill's most trusted confidant. Their conversations, now more reflective than ever, often centered on the legacy they had built together. A legacy not only of political victories and global influence but of personal resilience, a partnership that had endured the strains of public life. Churchill's family, particularly his children, played an increasingly important role in his final years. His daughter Mary, who had grown up under the weight of his public life, remained a loving and devoted presence, and his sons, too, continued to support him in his final days. It was through them that Churchill found much of his strength, not just because of their affection but because they represented the future, the next generation that would carry forward the values he had fought for. Though the world he had known was gone, he could take comfort in the continuity of his family, and in the knowledge that the principles he had upheld, democracy, freedom, and resilience, would continue to be passed on. As the 1960s drew on, Churchill's health continued to decline. He could no longer attend public events, no longer deliver the speeches that had once electrified the nation. But his place in the hearts of the British people had not diminished. He had already secured his place in history, but the affection and reverence with which he was held by the nation were never in doubt. For the British people, Churchill was not just a leader, he was a symbol, a reminder of the strength and resolve that had carried them through the darkest days of war. Even as he faded from the political stage, his legacy endured in the collective memory of a nation forever shaped by his leadership. In the quiet of his final days, as his health rapidly deteriorated, Churchill continued to reflect on the world that had passed him by. He had lived through more than any man could hope to experience in a lifetime, and now, as the end approached, he found a kind of peace in knowing that he had done his part. History would judge him as it always did, but Churchill knew that he had given his best. When Churchill died on January 24, 1965, the world paused in recognition of his passing. The man who had been the face of Britain's resistance in the face of Hitler, the man who had carried the hopes of a nation on his shoulders, was gone. But even as the world mourned, it knew that his influence would not fade. The principles he fought for, the resilience he embodied, would live on in the generations that followed. Winston Churchill had led Britain through its darkest hours, and now, as he passed from this world, he left behind a legacy that would continue to inspire for years to come. His life, his leadership, and his enduring spirit would remain a part of the fabric of British identity, a symbol of courage in the face of adversity, and a testament to the power of resilience in the face of time's relentless march. January 1965 marked the end of an era. Winston Churchill, the man who had defied the odds in war, who had lifted Britain's spirits when all seemed lost, passed away at the age of 90. His death was more than the loss of an individual, it was the loss of a symbol. The man who had embodied British courage, defiance, and resilience, whose voice had rallied a nation to stand firm against tyranny, was gone. The grief was palpable, and yet there was a sense that Churchill had already secured his place in history, not just as a politician or war hero, but as a defining figure of the 20th century. On the day of his death, Britain stood still. Flags flew at half-mast and church bells rang out, tolling not just for Churchill, but for the passing of a world that had been forever altered by his leadership. The streets of London, once the backdrop for Churchill's defiant speeches during the Blitz, were now silent with mourning. People gathered in their homes and on the streets, some weeping, others reflecting in quiet reverence. The man who had once stood in defiance of the world's most formidable enemy was now gone, but his legacy, both personal and political, had become woven into the fabric of Britain itself. The British people, in their collective grief, understood that Churchill had shaped the very essence of their national identity. He had been their steadfast leader in the face of unimaginable challenges, and his leadership had carried them through the war. Yet, beyond the immediate victory, it was his courage, his unwillingness to accept defeat, that had inspired them. Churchill had been the voice that told them to never surrender, and now, as his own life came to an end, that very spirit of defiance lived on in the hearts of those who had followed him. The state funeral held in his honor on January 30, 1965, was a fitting tribute to the man who had been both a hero and a symbol for his country. It was an event that brought together leaders from across the world, queens, presidents, and dignitaries, all acknowledging Churchill's immense impact on the world stage. The service at St. Paul's Cathedral, with its soaring arches and reverent atmosphere, became the site of an outpouring of national grief. In a fitting echo of his wartime leadership, the funeral procession passed through the streets of London, where ordinary citizens gathered in silence, many unable to hold back their tears. For them, Churchill had been more than a leader, he had been a father figure, a protector, a hero who had helped to shape their world. As his coffin, draped in the Union Jack, was carried through the streets, the people of London stood in solemn tribute. Dockworkers along the Thames paused in their work to bow their heads. Children perched on rooftops, eager to glimpse the passing cortege. The city, which had once been bombed into ruin during the Blitz, was now paying homage to the man who had made that very survival possible. His funeral was a national moment of reflection, a moment in which Britain, in its quiet grief, acknowledged the magnitude of the life they had lost. Yet, despite the grandeur of the funeral, there was an air of quiet simplicity to it all. Churchill had always been a man of paradoxes, grand in vision and speeches, yet with a humility that sometimes went unrecognized. His funeral, much like his life, reflected this duality. It was not adorned with the trappings of excess, but rather with the dignity and solemnity that mirrored his own nature. Churchill had always understood the power of symbolism, and his passing became a symbol not just of his political career, but of the enduring spirit of Britain. The British Empire may have been fading, but the values he had championed, freedom, democracy, and resolve, would continue to define the nation long after his death. Though Churchill's funeral was a moment of national mourning, it was also a time of reflection on the indelible mark he had left on history. His influence extended beyond Britain's borders. The world recognized his leadership during World War II, not just as a military victory, but as a triumph of the human spirit. He had shown the world that courage could defeat the darkest of tyrants, that resolve could stand against the tide of oppression. His leadership had secured not only Britain's future but had played a critical role in shaping the post-war world order. In the days that followed his funeral, the world's leaders reflected on the legacy Churchill had left behind. To many he was more than a politician, he was a symbol of resistance, a figure who had personified the strength of a nation in crisis. His speeches, his actions, his unwavering resolve in the face of defeat and despair had inspired generations, and now, as the world entered the Cold War and the post-imperial era, Churchill's legacy was cemented. He had navigated Britain through its most perilous hour, and though his vision of the British Empire was fading, the essence of his leadership, his belief in democracy, in freedom, in the resilience of the human spirit, would continue to resonate. Churchill's death, though mourned deeply, was also the final affirmation of the greatness of his life. He had been a man of extraordinary ambition, vision, and courage, but he had also been a man who had faced his own flaws and limitations with a kind of grace that came only with age. In his final years, as he painted and reflected on the world that had changed so much, he came to terms with the fact that his time had passed, and yet his influence would not. The torch, as he had once said, was being passed, but its flame would continue to burn. Churchill's life, filled with triumph, as he was laid to rest in the small churchyard of Blaydon, near his birthplace, the simplicity of his grave spoke volumes. There were no grand monuments, no towering obelisks, only a simple marker, the final reflection of a man who had given everything to his country. It was a quiet, humble ending for a man who had once seemed larger than life. And in that quietness, in the peace of Blaydon, Churchill found his final rest. Though the world had changed, his voice would echo through time, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when all seemed lost, there would always be those willing to stand firm, and like Churchill, never surrender. The passing of Winston Churchill in 1965 left a void not just in Britain, but across the world. The grief of a nation that had relied on his leadership during its darkest days was palpable, yet as time moved on, Churchill's legacy only seemed to grow in stature. History, as Churchill had always believed, would judge him kindly, and it did. The man who had stood alone against Hitler, who had steered Britain through the flames of war, was now revered as one of the greatest leaders the world had ever known. The judgment of history, however, was not simply about military victory or the strength of his speeches. It was about something deeper, about the values he embodied and the vision he fought to preserve. Churchill's legacy was not without its flaws. His policies, particularly regarding the British Empire, were often controversial. He had been a steadfast defender of imperialism, a belief that, in the years following the war, seemed increasingly out of step with the realities of the post-colonial world. His insistence on the continuity of British imperial power had contributed to tensions within the Commonwealth and had been a source of friction with emerging nations striving for independence. His views on race, as expressed in some of his speeches and writings, were seen by many as outdated, and his opposition to certain social reforms had alienated segments of the British public. Yet, despite these complexities, Churchill's greatness could not be denied. The history that would judge Churchill was not one confined to his personal beliefs or his political missteps. It was one that recognized the monumental scale of his leadership during World War II. It was during the war that Churchill truly proved his mettle, in his speeches, in his decisions, and in his ability to inspire a nation to stand firm against the onslaught of tyranny. It was Churchill who told Britain to stand resolute when Nazi bombs rained down on London. It was Churchill who, against all odds, refused to surrender when Britain was isolated in its fight against Hitler. These moments of indomitable will are what defined him in the eyes of history. Churchill's role in shaping the post-war world was equally significant. His influence on the founding of the United Nations, his advocacy for the maintenance of European peace, and his understanding of the emerging Cold War dynamics were pivotal. His famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946, delivered in Fulton, Missouri, warned of the rise of Soviet power in Eastern Europe and helped shape Western foreign policy for decades. Though criticized at the time by some as alarmist, it was a prescient warning of the ideological divide that would define the Cold War. Churchill may have seen the world changing, but he never lost his ability to act as a guiding light, showing others the way forward. His life, marked by extraordinary highs and deeply painful lows, became an embodiment of resilience. The defeats of his early political career, his ousting from power after World War II, and his return to lead Britain again in the 1950s all served to illustrate his deep character. Churchill's rise, fall, and rise again was not just a story of political survival, but of the persistence of spirit. Even when his time as an active leader came to an end, Churchill remained a voice of authority in the world, offering wisdom and guidance, albeit from the sidelines. For the British people, and indeed for the world, Churchill had become a symbol of national and moral courage. He had led a nation through the storm, and when it had passed, he had kept his faith in the principles of liberty, democracy, and resilience. His wartime leadership was unmatched, but it was his ability to inspire a nation and galvanize people into action during the darkest moments that made him a legend. The wars he fought in, both political and military, were not just fought with armies and speeches. They were fought with an unshakable belief in the values of freedom and human dignity. As the decades passed after his death, the world continued to honor Churchill's contributions. Monuments were erected in his name, his speeches were studied in schools, and his legacy was enshrined in history. But perhaps the most enduring element of Churchill's legacy was the simple power of his words. "We shall never surrender" became not just a wartime rallying cry, but a mantra for generations to come. His words resonated long after the bombs had stopped falling, long after the war had ended, because they spoke to something universal: the human capacity to endure in the face of overwhelming adversity. Churchill had once said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And indeed it was kind. It had recorded his story not just as a man who led Britain to victory, but as a figure who had changed the course of history. He had fought for his country, and in doing so had given the world a model of what it meant to stand firm, to act with courage, and to never accept defeat. His name would forever be synonymous with the struggle for freedom and the unwavering spirit of those who refused to surrender. The world that emerged after Churchill's death was different, shaped by the Cold War, by the rise of new powers, and by the transformation of global politics. But Churchill's legacy remained a touchstone for future generations, a reminder of a time when one man's resolve had held back the tide of tyranny. And even as the world moved forward into new challenges, Churchill's example remained as relevant as ever: that the fight for freedom is constant, that resilience is key, and that no matter how dark the moment, hope and resolve can light the way. In the final judgment of history, Churchill was not just remembered for his victories, but for the essence of his character.